Good evening. It is August 2nd, 2024, and this is going to be an update on what was Invest 97L, now has been deemed potential tropical cyclone number 4. The potential tropical cyclone designation is for systems that haven't met the criteria yet for a tropical cyclone. However, in the essence of time, the National Hurricane Center wants to give residents and people opportunities to get prepared. So they need to, in order to do that, they need to designate it as a potential tropical cyclone for warnings and watches to go ahead and be issued. So currently right now we're seeing that our potential tropical cyclone is beginning to look a lot more robust and a lot more developed. We can see here some banding features that are starting to develop on the northern end of the cyclone. And we also starting to get some feeder bands into the Florida Straits. And we're starting to notice that the center are starting to develop somewhere on the southern edge of Cuba. Now this is important because yesterday we talked about where the center may begin to develop was essential for track location. There were two scenarios yesterday that I spoke of, one of them being a northern route where the center forms a little bit north and began to track maybe just north or maybe on the spine of Cuba. That looks as though that scenario is not playing out, and it looks as though that the center is probably developing somewhere south of the island of Cuba. And that's important because that gives the system a little bit more time to develop over water as it begins to take a west-northwest track and eventually starts to make its way a more northwest direction. That may give the system a little bit more time to develop just south of Cuba before it makes a landfall into Cuba as it crosses over into the Florida Straits. That's important not only for intensity, but also for the purposes of track as well. A system a little further to the south may track a little bit more west than what the current National Hurricane Center model depicts. And that is important because little small differences at the beginning stages make a huge difference later on in the game. So it looks as though the southern lobe or the southern track is starting to be a little bit more of a believable option at this point. Now we're going to take a quick look at the National Hurricane Center's advisory, the 5 p.m. advisory. We can see here that potential cyclone, the center of circulation, they have it here located just on the island of Cuba. And that's important because if for some reason it's maybe located here versus here, that may have long-range implications on a possible track and possible movement. Now, I'm just drawing this out as an example. Don't follow this track, but that may be an option to where this cone may shift a little bit more westward as we get to the 11 p.m. advisory. But for right now, we have a potential tropical cyclone for it as of 5 p.m. Winds are at about 30 miles per hour, moving west-northwest at about 16 miles per hour. And this is important because we mentioned earlier about the potential cyclone designation. That's important because we do now have watches and warnings up, tropical storm watches for portions of Lower Miami-Dade County and the Keys. And then we also have tropical storm warnings for portions of Southwest Florida, and portions just north of about Fort Myers northward are also currently under tropical storm watches. So it seems as though the southwest portions of Florida may begin to experience some tropical storm conditions beginning in about 48 hours, and that is the reason for the potential cyclone designation, so we can go ahead and get those watches and warnings out to folks so they can begin to prepare and get themselves ready for the storm. Now we're going to look at a couple of ensembles like we did yesterday. Taking a look at the European ensemble, we can see the ideal is basically taking a storm, our storm, which would probably become Debby shortly within the next 2 days or so, into portions of central and west Cuba and bringing it into the Florida Straits. The direction or the position of the center is very important. If it's down here somewhere, maybe it's more favorable that it may take a track just west of this black ensemble mean line. So it's very important where that center is located, and I'm pretty sure that the hurricane hunters will be in there later on this evening or possibly early as tomorrow to get a good fix on where the system may go. Pretty much the same story here on the GFS as well, where we see a system traveling along the coast of Cuba. Now I believe this one is a little bit more on the order of on the northern end of the cone and ensemble means. So we can see here that this brings a system all the way through the spine of Cuba, and it's a little bit more east than the European, and this seems as though that this may be shifted a little bit more to the west, because I believe that the center is somewhere located in this area. Now, don't quote me on it, but based off of satellite observation, it looks as though the center may be formed a little bit further south of the American model. Now, that is important, like I mentioned, because it also has a lot to do with where the system is going. Now, let's take a quick look at the 18Z GFS. And as we take this out in time, we can see that the system somewhat initializes in the center of Cuba, and it begins to strengthen as it gets into the Florida Straits. We can see here that we see a bundling of more of a bona fide center just west of Key West. And that is important as we go out in time, because that system will begin to strengthen since it has already a center located near the west of Cuba. And we can see that that system begins to strengthen, and it looks like it makes a landfall near the Big Bend area of Florida. Now, there is a wrinkle in all of this, because at some point we believe that the steering currents are going to possibly break down, and it may induce what we see known as a stall here just off the coast, the east coast of United States. Now, this is a little further out in time, so we don't want to get too stuck on location right now, but there is a possibility that once this system becomes Debby, that there's a chance that this storm may begin to stall in some areas just into the southeast. That is something to keep in mind, and I'm going to show you the European to kind of give you another example of what's going on. So here's a look at the European, kind of the same thinking. I think this is a little bit too far to the east. I think there will be some adjustments to this track to the west as we look at the zero Z runs later on tonight, and you can see it brings itself into the Big Bend area just like the GFS, and then there begins to be a stall, and it looks as though it shows on this run impacting portions of the southeast. However, let's not get too excited about landfall locations, because this is far out into the forecast and a lot can change between now and that time. But there is a possibility of a stall coming for this system once it makes its way north, just to the east, just to the west of the state of Florida, into the eastern Gulf, and possibly a landfall in Florida. And there is an opportunity for the system to get caught up in a call where basically the steering currents are very weak and the storm just kind of wants to sit there. So we're going to have to see how these things play out as we get further off in time. The main thing about this storm, especially in portions of Florida, is going to be the rain. We can see here that we have hefty rain totals ranging anywhere from about 2 to about 8 inches or so. Some areas may see localized areas of flooding, maybe even higher than 8 inches, somewhere between 8 to 12 inches. But depending on where this actual movement or the track of this storm is, will determine who gets the majority of the rain. It looks as though if you're on the west coast of Florida, you're going to pretty much be locked in and guaranteed for at least about 5 inches of rain, depending on where you are. Some areas may see more than that. So you want to make sure that you're prepared for the rain, and there may be a chance for a wind event depending on how rapidly this system intensifies as it gets into the Gulf. There is some indications that there may be some strengthening before it makes landfall. So you want to prepare yourself for rain and also a wind event as well. Now, we're going to go ahead and start looking at what may possibly be out there in the Atlantic, and something kind of stood out to me lately in the last few frames, that we have a system in the middle of the Atlantic, not necessarily organized yet, but there is a tropical wave, and it looks pretty robust as we look here on the infrared view, sitting somewhere in the central Atlantic Ocean, and it's moving its way westward. And some of the models are beginning to perk up on some of this. We're getting to that point now where we're getting deeper into the hurricane season, and we're nearing August 20th, which is the official start of hurricane season, where we begin to see this African wave train propagate a lot of these waves westward. And as these waves go westward, if they get themselves into a favorable environment, we can see these systems like this begin to spin up, possibly in the Caribbean, or if there's a little weakness, get themselves somewhere here in the Southwest Atlantic. So we're going to have to start paying attention to these waves as they start to begin to roll themselves off of the coast of Africa. And let's take a quick look at some ensembles, and we can see here in the European ensemble, as we get later out in time, that we're starting to see some signs of a wave somewhere in the central Atlantic beginning to show itself in the model. So it's something that we have to keep an eye on. So if you have any interest and some of the islands in the Lesser Antilles and the Lesser Antilles, and eventually probably the Greater Antilles, we definitely want to keep our eye on the tropics, as we're starting to get to that point in the season where we're going to have to take everything very seriously. That is the end of my update. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. But like I said, always make sure that you're looking at the National Hurricane Center and your local weather authorities for any advice and any decisions that you want to make regarding yourself, evacuations, and your safety. Until next time, have a good one. Thank you.